By the end of 1944, the German war machine was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins, the fuel was gone, and the factories that once produced the might of the Reich had been reduced to rubble. Yet even then, many German soldiers still believed that the Americans, for all their material wealth, lacked discipline, ingenuity, and soul. They thought of America as a land of consumers, not warriors. That illusion would not survive captivity. When the first ships carrying German prisoners of war reached American shores, the men were stunned. They had expected rough prison camps, cold meals, and humiliation. Instead, they were brought to a land bursting with energy and abundance. Fields of grain that seemed endless, towns untouched by war, and trains that ran without interruption. But nothing compared to what they saw when some of them were sent to work near the heart of America's industrial power, its factories. To the German mind, the word factory meant something very specific. Gray buildings, cramped workshops, a few thousand men hammering metal under the eyes of overseers. It was efficient, ordered, but small in scale. The Third Reich had prided itself on precision, not mass. The Americans, they assumed, were too chaotic to sustain such organization. But then the buses rolled past Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and the myth began to shatter. The POWs stared out the windows, silent, watching as the horizon disappeared behind endless smokestacks, warehouses, and rail lines stretching farther than the eye could see. These were not factories. They were entire cities of production. In some camps, the U.S. Army assigned German POWs to assist in nearby industrial zones, mainly as laborers or farmhands. But even those who never entered a plant saw the scale firsthand. A former Luftwaffe sergeant later wrote, "We had believed our factories in the Ruhr were the greatest in the world. Then we saw America. One Ford plant produced more trucks in a week than all of Germany could in a month." He wasn't exaggerating. By 1944, the Ford River Rouge plant in Michigan employed over 80,000 workers. It consumed coal, iron ore, rubber, and glass at one end and rolled out finished vehicles at the other. One complete every 49 seconds. To the Germans, this was industrial sorcery. For men who had been told that the Allied nations were decadent, the truth was unsettling. America's war effort was not just about machines, it was about organization. It was the visible proof that democracy could not only fight, but outproduce tyranny. As one German officer later admitted, "We believed in efficiency through fear. They achieved it through cooperation." That was our first shock. The German POWs realized something they had never been allowed to imagine, that freedom could be productive. And the more they saw, the more they began to understand why the Reich had lost. It wasn't just about the bombs or the tanks. It was about the sheer scale of a nation that could build faster than anyone could destroy. For many German prisoners, their first real encounter with America's industrial might came not through maps or statistics, but through sound. The deep rumble of turbines, the constant clang of metal on metal, the ceaseless rhythm of production that never slept. Even miles away from the plants, you could feel it, the hum of a nation in motion. When German POWs were sent to work on nearby farms or construction sites, they often caught sight of massive complexes in the distance, automobile plants, aircraft factories, steel mills. To them, it looked like something out of science fiction. These weren't small workshops of a few hundred men. These were entire ecosystems. Rail cars carried in raw materials. Conveyor belts snaked through miles of buildings, and trucks rolled out loaded with finished goods, ready to ship straight to the front. A former Wehrmacht engineer, captured in Tunisia and sent to Illinois, later recalled, "We had imagined American factories to be like ours. Efficient, yes, but limited. What we saw were machines of civilization themselves. It was not just production, it was power, concentrated and endless." The Germans had always believed in craftsmanship, in the precision of a well-trained worker producing a perfect component. But America had mastered something entirely different, the art of scale. Their factories didn't depend on a handful of skilled specialists. Instead, they relied on thousands of workers and an army of machines, all standardized and interchangeable. The POWs couldn't comprehend how such complexity remained organized. To them, it was almost absurd. Women, immigrants, and factory hands operating side by side, coordinated by schedules, punch cards, and flowcharts. And yet the results were undeniable. The United States could build in days what had taken Germany weeks. Inside the camps, rumors spread quickly. Men who had seen the American plants told others about what they'd witnessed. Stories circulated about one aircraft plant in Seattle producing more B-17 bombers in a month than all of Germany could manage in a year. At first, many refused to believe it. Propaganda, they said. But when more witnesses confirmed the same thing, silence followed. It wasn't propaganda, it was reality. One prisoner, a former tank mechanic, wrote in his journal, "Back home, our factories are bombed to dust. Here, they build planes faster than we can shoot them down. Now I see that this war cannot be won by courage alone." The Germans had been told that American soldiers were soft, that their comforts made them weak. But standing before the endless rows of smokestacks, the POWs realized the truth. The real weapon of the United States wasn't its soldiers, it was its workers. In every furnace, every assembly line, every trainload of supplies, they saw the proof of a new kind of warfare. One fought not by ideology, but by industry. And for the first time, they began to wonder, could any nation, no matter how proud, stand against such power? By 1944, thousands of German prisoners of war were scattered across the United States. From the plains of Kansas to the forests of Wisconsin, from the farms of Texas to the shipyards of the Pacific coast. Many of them, skilled laborers or engineers, were quietly put to work supporting the American war economy. It was here, inside the heart of industrial America, that they witnessed something no Nazi propaganda had ever prepared them for. Some of the POWs were assigned to repair shops that supplied parts for local industries. Others were placed in labor detachments near vast production complexes, places like the Ford River Rouge plant in Michigan or the Douglas Aircraft Factory in California. To them, these were not factories. They were cities of steel and smoke, alive 24 hours a day. One former German engineer later wrote, "It was like standing at the base of a mountain that never ended. Conveyors carried car parts overhead like rivers. The noise was constant, but it was not chaos. It was rhythm." The most striking revelation for the Germans was not just the size, but the efficiency. They saw women operating cranes, riveting wings, welding armor plates. They saw foremen with stopwatches timing production runs. Everything had a purpose. Every movement was part of a grand system. To the Germans, this was cultural shock. Their own industrial culture valued mastery, the craftsman perfecting his skill through years of apprenticeship. But in America, it wasn't mastery that won wars. It was organization. A POW mechanic from Hamburg later said, "In Germany, we built machines as art. In America, they build them as life. Their work never stops. It flows." Even more unsettling was the realization that America's industrial power was decentralized. Every region, the Midwest, the South, the West Coast, had its own centers of production. If one factory fell, a dozen more kept running. This was something the German military had never understood. While Allied bombers shattered the Ruhr, Detroit kept rolling, Chicago kept forging, and California kept building. To the prisoners who had believed in Germany's total war effort, this was hard to grasp. How could a democracy, a land of freedom and debate, outproduce a dictatorship built for war? The answer, they realized, lay in unity of purpose. Every man and woman seemed driven by a common goal, not fear, but determination. Inside the POW camps, talk of the American factories became a kind of obsession. Men argued over numbers, estimates, and rumors. Some refused to believe what they had seen. Others, especially the engineers, quietly accepted the truth. The Allies were not winning because they fought better, but because they built better. One German officer summarized it best in a letter never sent home. "We fought to prove that spirit could overcome material. But now I see their material is their spirit." For those men, the sight of American factories was more than an industrial revelation. It was a psychological one. It shattered the illusion of German superiority, the belief that discipline and ideology could conquer everything. They began to see the war not as a failure of soldiers, but of vision. And in that realization, the first cracks appeared in the wall of pride that had carried them to war. As 1944 turned into 1945, more German prisoners were transferred from the agricultural South to the industrial heartlands of America. There, behind guarded fences, they worked in support roles, repairing tools, loading freight, cleaning machine shops. It was supposed to be routine labor, but what they witnessed went far beyond routine. The first time a group of captured Luftwaffe mechanics were taken past the General Motors plant in Detroit, they fell silent. Stretching for nearly a mile, the factory seemed to move like a living organism, steel sheets entering one end, fully formed engines roaring out the other. To men who had grown up in a nation that idolized precision craftsmanship, it was almost incomprehensible. One prisoner later wrote, "It was like watching an army of machines fight a battle with time and win." The Germans had been told that America's wealth was wasteful, that its people were lazy, and its factories disorganized. What they saw instead was a society that had turned abundance into discipline. Each worker had a role, each process a purpose. They watched American women operate heavy equipment with ease, something unthinkable in wartime Germany. They saw African American workers labor side by side with white colleagues, producing the same weapons that were tearing apart the Third Reich. Even that shocked them. For men raised in a system obsessed with hierarchy and purity, this unity was deeply confusing, yet undeniably effective. One German engineer admitted, "They fight with everyone, from everywhere." And it works. When the prisoners were later shown the scale of production through government propaganda films, they realized how small Germany truly was. Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, Ford, each could produce more planes in a month than German factories could in a year under bombardment. What struck them most wasn't just quantity, but repair. Damaged bombers that limped back to America were rebuilt, rearmed, and returned to combat within weeks. Nothing went to waste. One POW in Kansas wrote, "Their broken machines returned to the sky faster than ours are buried." The Germans began to compare this system with their own. In Germany, resources were centralized, micromanaged by bureaucracy and ideology. Factories needed permission for every part. Efficiency was lost in fear. In America, the opposite reigned. Trust in scale, faith in the process. A captured engineer from Bremen summed it up in one line. "The Americans build like they breathe, without thinking, but with power." By now, even the most hardened officers were beginning to understand the truth. The industrial war Germany had started was one it could never finish. Not against a nation that could build tanks like cars and ships like toys. What they had witnessed was not just industrial superiority, it was the mobilization of an entire culture. And as the war in Europe neared its end, the German POWs in America realized something they could never say aloud. They were looking at the future, and it didn't belong to Germany anymore. By early 1945, as the war in Europe neared collapse, thousands of German prisoners were still scattered across the American heartland. Many were assigned to work near or within the perimeters of industrial facilities, warehouses, foundries, rail yards, and supply depots. What they saw there shattered everything they had believed about modern warfare. One group of prisoners of war in Illinois was transported daily past the Caterpillar Tractor Company. From their trucks, they saw lines of machines assembling engines for tanks, bulldozers, and landing craft. The assembly lines never stopped. The lights never dimmed. Even on weekends, the factories hummed. One prisoner later wrote home, "In Germany, we have factories. In America, they have cities that build the sheer coordination of production was unlike anything they had imagined. Raw materials from one state, processed parts from another, assembled in a third. Rail lines ran like arteries, feeding the war effort from coast to coast. No single plant worked alone. Every factory was part of a vast, beating network. For the Germans who had suffered under constant bombing and resource shortages, it was incomprehensible. Their homeland's industry was dying in pieces. America's, by contrast, seemed invincible. One POW later confessed, "We thought total war meant destruction. Here, total war means creation." In Camp McAllister, Oklahoma, a group of engineers captured in North Africa were shown newsreels of Detroit's production numbers. They watched as Ford's Willow Run plant produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. The camera panned across endless lines of aircraft stretching beyond sight. The prisoners sat in silence. One of them whispered, "If they can build this much in a day, how could we ever have hoped to win?" They began to see that the true weapon of the Allies was not the bomber or the tank, it was the factory. Behind every American soldier stood a worker. Behind every victory stood an engine built by millions of unseen hands. To the prisoners of war, that realization carried a bitter irony. The German propaganda they had once believed claimed that America was decadent and disorganized. Yet here they were, standing in the heart of a country that could outproduce entire empires. A German officer in a Louisiana camp wrote, "They have turned freedom into machinery. It moves faster than tyranny ever could." Even those who despised the United States began to feel a kind of reluctant awe. The country's power didn't come from cruelty or control. It came from cooperation. Farmers, women, immigrants, all contributed to a system that turned raw earth into power. One former Wehrmacht mechanic summed it up best. In Germany, a worker obeys. In America, a worker builds. By the time spring arrived, the war in Europe was ending. The prisoners knew it. Yet standing in the shadows of America's factories, they realized something far more enduring than military defeat. They had seen the industrial heart of a democracy, and it was stronger than any empire. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, thousands of its soldiers were still behind American fences. Farmers, clerks, engineers, and officers alike. But for many, the real captivity wasn't behind the barbed wire. It was inside their own disbelief. They could not reconcile what they had seen with what they had been taught. At Camp Swift in Texas, several captured engineers were allowed to work near aircraft repair facilities. There, they witnessed hundreds of American planes lined up for maintenance. Bombers, transports, and fighters, all serviced like clockwork. Each had a specific team, tools, and schedule. One of the Germans turned to another and said quietly, "This is not repair. This is resurrection." Every broken plane was restored in days, sometimes hours. The precision and rhythm left the prisoners in awe. They realized that American power wasn't about perfection, it was about process. Every worker, mechanic, and foreman was part of a chain that never broke. For many of the POWs, it was their first exposure to a truly industrialized democracy. They had grown up believing that efficiency required authority, that discipline required fear. Yet in these factories, they saw something different, a workforce that moved with confidence, not coercion. They noticed that workers joked, listened to music, even argued with supervisors. Yet the production never slowed. To men raised under totalitarian control, it was unthinkable. One prisoner later wrote in his journal, "They work without being watched." That is their secret in Iowa and Kansas. POWs assigned to agricultural equipment plants began to understand the scale of America's supply chain. Steel from Pittsburgh, rubber from Akron, fuel from Texas. All connected by rail, all synchronized by a system of logistics that could feed armies halfway around the world. They realized that the American war machine wasn't built by generals. It was built by geography, by organization, by planning that stretched across an entire continent. A German logistics officer, captured in Normandy, described it later in a post-war interview. "When I saw their rail lines and their factories, I understood. We were fighting an idea made real. The idea that no nation is too large to organize itself." Letters from POW camps began to carry a different tone. Gone was the arrogance, the old belief in German industrial superiority. In its place was quiet wonder, and sometimes envy. "We were told America was chaos," one soldier wrote home, "but their chaos builds order. Their freedom builds strength, and perhaps most humbling of all, the prisoners saw who worked beside the machines. Women in coveralls, African-American laborers, and immigrant crews from Italy, Poland, and Mexico, all contributing to the same cause. To men who had been taught that hierarchy defined strength, the sight was almost incomprehensible. As one former officer later admitted, "We laughed at their diversity. But that was their weapon, unity through difference. Their machines did not care who built them. By the end of that summer, the German POWs had stopped calling the Americans lucky. They began to call them inevitable, and deep down they understood. It wasn't just the size of America's factories that had won the war. It was the spirit that filled them. In the summer of 1945, as America shifted from war production to peacetime industry, thousands of German prisoners were still working in and around factories that had once supplied the front lines. They had come to understand that these were not just buildings. They were monuments to a way of thinking. Every assembly line, every rail spur, every conveyor belt told a story of a nation that believed in scale, not scarcity. At a Ford Motor plant in Michigan, a group of German mechanics assigned to maintenance duty watched in silence as a line of vehicles rolled past. Trucks, tractors, even prefabricated houses, all being produced in the same massive hall that once built bombers. One POW later said, "We thought America would slow down after the war." But it did not stop. It simply changed what it built. To men who had seen German cities reduced to rubble, the endless hum of American production felt surreal. In the Reich, factories had been buried, bombed, and scattered. But here in the heartland, they were expanding. The prisoners saw cranes lifting new steel beams into place, workers repurposing lines for consumer goods, and warehouses stacked with parts and materials. One captured engineer from Stuttgart, who had once worked for Daimler-Benz, wrote in his journal, "They think in thousands. We thought in dozens." That is the difference between surviving a war and losing one. The Germans had prided themselves on craftsmanship, perfection through precision. But what they witnessed in America was a different philosophy, power through repetition. The machines didn't care about artistry, they cared about output. And yet it worked. Every factory seemed to be alive, pulsing, breathing, coordinated like a living organism. Some of the POWs compared it to the Reich's obsession with order. But the Americans' order was not forced. It was fluid. Mistakes were fixed quickly. Innovations came from the bottom up. Workers suggested improvements, and supervisors listened. That kind of freedom inside an industrial system was alien to them. One soldier later said, "In Germany, orders come from above. In America, progress comes from everywhere." Even outside the factories, the prisoners saw the vast infrastructure that made such power possible. Trains moving day and night, highways stretching to the horizon, rivers lined with barges. America's industry was not confined to cities. It spanned the entire landscape. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, POWs working near the port were stunned by the sheer movement of goods. Oil, steel, food, and machinery flowed through the docks like an endless tide. To them, it looked like an empire of logistics, a machine that could never be starved. One former Luftwaffe officer, watching rows of trucks being loaded, whispered, "This is why we lost the skies." When German engineers returned home after the war, many tried to explain what they had seen. They spoke of assembly lines that stretched for hundreds of meters, of workers who built planes as easily as tractors, of warehouses so vast that bicycles were used to cross them. Their countrymen often didn't believe them. The idea that one nation could produce such abundance sounded like propaganda. But for the men who had stood inside those factories, it was not a myth. It was a revelation. They had once laughed at American quantity over quality. Now they understood that quantity was quality, when it meant survival, adaptability, and power. For the German POWs who saw it firsthand, the memory of those massive halls and roaring engines would stay with them for life. Proof that in the modern world, the greatest weapon of all was not a tank or a plane, but a factory that never slept. By late 1945, many German prisoners had been relocated deeper into America's industrial heartland: Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Pennsylvania. There, they saw the true scale of the nation's war machine. What had seemed impossible in Europe, mass production without collapse, was alive and thriving here. At one aircraft plant in Kansas, prisoners assigned to cleanup duty found themselves inside a building that stretched farther than they could see. Row after row of machines, riveters, welders, cranes, all working in rhythm. They stood in stunned silence. One POW said later, "It was not a factory, it was a city under a roof." In Germany, the largest aircraft plants were vulnerable, cramped, and constantly bombed. They had worked underground, often in caves or tunnels, struggling to produce anything at scale. But here, under one enormous roof, the Americans had built B-29 bombers by the thousands. Each one rolled out, finished, tested, fueled, and ready to fly. A former German production engineer reportedly said, "We fought against their planes, but never imagined the world that built them. Now I understand. They built faster than we could destroy." To the POWs, it was not just the machinery that impressed them. It was the people. Men and women worked side by side, moving efficiently without shouting or supervision. They joked, sang, and followed routines that seemed second nature. There was order, but not fear. Discipline, but not oppression. It was the opposite of the factories they had known in Germany, where labor was militarized, punishments were swift, and mistakes could cost lives. Here, work was a partnership, and it showed in the atmosphere, the calm, the precision, the quiet confidence. One German soldier later told an interviewer, "I saw no overseers with whips, no soldiers with rifles. Yet the Americans worked faster than we ever did. That frightened me more than their weapons." In Detroit, the prisoners who worked near automobile plants were astonished by how quickly war production was converted back to peace. Tanks became tractors, jeeps became delivery trucks, and aircraft parts turned into farm equipment. The same factories that had powered the war effort were now powering a new kind of world. To German eyes, this was inconceivable. Their own cities were rubble, their industries were gone. But in America, production never stopped. It simply changed purpose. The nation that had armed millions was now preparing to feed and rebuild. One POW, a machinist from Bremen, said quietly, "They do not fight for survival. They fight for progress." That is something we never understood. In reports written after the war, Allied intelligence noted how deeply the German prisoners were affected by what they saw. Many wrote letters home describing machines that never slept and buildings large enough to house villages. Some even admitted admiration, not for America's weapons, but for its unity. They realized that industrial might was not born from fear, but from cooperation, from a system where workers, engineers, and leaders worked together, not apart. When they were finally repatriated, these men carried that image with them. Endless assembly lines, towering cranes, and the sense of a country whose strength came not from domination, but from creation. One former POW summed it up years later. "We thought war was won by destruction. They showed us it is won by production." To those who saw the inside of America's factories, it was not just a revelation, it was a glimpse of the future. By 1946, the war had ended, but the German prisoners still housed in America remained witnesses to something extraordinary. A nation that had mobilized its industry for war and then, with equal speed, turned it toward peace. The same factories that had once produced tanks and bombers were now producing cars, refrigerators, and farm machinery. The transformation seemed impossible to men who came from a country still buried in ruins. At one Ford plant in Michigan, POWs assigned to clean and maintain machinery saw entire production lines retooled in weeks. The speed of adaptation left them speechless. One wrote later, "In Germany, we could build great machines, but we could not rebuild our world. The Americans can do both." Many German engineers among the prisoners were quietly taking notes, sketching diagrams, and observing the American methods. The guards often joked that they were learning more about democracy from the factory floor than from any classroom. But it was true. What they saw in those massive workshops was the visible expression of a free society at work. There were no secret police, no fear, no whispers. Mistakes were corrected, not punished. Suggestions were welcomed, not silenced. To men raised under a regime that prized obedience above innovation, this was both alien and inspiring. A former Luftwaffe technician said later, "We had genius, but no freedom." They had freedom, and that made millions of geniuses. The prisoners came to understand something deeper, that the size of American factories was not just a matter of square footage. It was a symbol of capacity, industrial, intellectual, and moral. The United States could afford to think long-term. It could build not just machines, but systems that empowered ordinary workers. In one camp near Chicago, POWs who worked as mechanics were taken on a supervised tour of a manufacturing plant producing engines for civilian use. They watched as parts moved down the assembly line with mechanical precision, each worker performing a single step in perfect rhythm. It was not chaotic, it was harmony in steel. One POW wrote afterward, "I felt I was watching an orchestra, not of violins but of machines. Each man was a musician, and the conductor was the system itself." The scale defied imagination. German factories had been destroyed, decentralized, and scattered by bombing. But here, under one roof, stood acres of humming machinery and endless light. At night, the buildings glowed like small cities, their windows shining against the dark. One prisoner said quietly to another, "They do not just have factories. They have nations inside their walls." That realization struck a chord. For years, the Germans had believed their efficiency was unmatched, that their precision engineering made them superior. But now they saw that true power was not precision alone, but abundance combined with organization. In post-war debriefings, Allied officers noted that many German prisoners returned home with a different outlook, humbled, reflective, even changed. They no longer saw America as merely rich or lucky. They saw it as disciplined in a way their own nation had never been. One report from the U.S. War Department observed, "The German prisoners who labored in American industry returned to their homeland not defeated in spirit, but educated in the philosophy of production." That education would echo into the future. Many of those former POWs would later help rebuild West Germany's industrial base, guided by the lessons they had learned watching American factories at work. They adopted efficiency without tyranny, precision without oppression, and leadership built on collaboration rather than fear. The POWs had come to America as soldiers of a fallen empire. They would leave as witnesses to something far greater, the industrial engine of democracy itself. By 1947, most of the German prisoners of war were on their way home. The camps were closing, the war was over, and the great American factories that had once forged the weapons of victory were now producing the tools of peace. But for the men who had worked within them, who had seen the vastness of America's industrial might with their own eyes, the experience would never fade. They had arrived as captives, filled with propaganda and pride. They had believed that Germany's engineering genius was the peak of modern civilization, that no nation could match it. Yet as they boarded ships for Europe, they carried with them a different kind of memory, of smokestacks stretching into the horizon, of assembly lines that never stopped, of workers who built with purpose, not fear. One POW, an engineer from Bremen, wrote in his post-war journal, "In Germany, we believe that order came from authority. In America, order comes from cooperation. That is why they built faster, stronger, and longer than we could." Those words would prove prophetic. When these men returned to the ruins of their homeland, they became part of something few had foreseen, the rebirth of West Germany's industry. And many of them, consciously or not, brought with them the lessons they had learned in the American factories. They rebuilt factories not as monuments to hierarchy, but as systems of efficiency. They copied the principles they had seen in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago: mass production, quality control, and a focus on reliability over perfection. Within a decade, Germany's new industries were thriving again. A former prisoner who had worked briefly at a Ford facility later said, "We did not rebuild Germany in the image of the old Reich. We rebuilt it in the image of what we saw in America." For many, those months of captivity became a strange form of education. They had seen the power of democracy, not in speeches or books, but in factories, in the collaboration of ordinary men and women producing extraordinary results. They had learned that strength came not from domination, but from shared purpose. And that realization changed them. When asked years later what impressed them most about America, many former POWs did not mention wealth or food or freedom. They said the factories, because those factories represented more than machines. They represented a mindset, a belief that every person, from the lowest laborer to the highest engineer, played a role in something greater than themselves. Historians would later note that the German prisoners' exposure to American industry left a quiet but lasting imprint on post-war Europe. The efficiency of the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of infrastructure, even the birth of new automotive and electronics industries, all carried the shadow of lessons learned behind American fences. It was an irony of history. Men sent across an ocean as enemies returned, as witnesses to a new world. In interviews decades later, some former POWs spoke of their time in the camps not with bitterness, but with gratitude. One said, "We learned that power without compassion destroys, but power with purpose builds." Another, who had once worked in a General Motors plant under guard, said softly, "I realized then that we had lost not only the war, but the future, because they were already building it." The story of the German POWs who saw America's factories is not just a story of war, it is a story of revelation. It is about how men raised in the shadow of tyranny came to understand the strength of freedom through the rhythm of machines, the hum of assembly lines, and the sight of workers who built for something greater than conquest. When they left, they no longer laughed at American industry. They respected it, and in time, they rebuilt their world with its lessons. The factories they saw had built the arsenal of democracy, but for those who witnessed them, they built something even greater: understanding. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.